So, on behalf of Baraka Books, I welcome you all. It's a pleasure to see many of you, among other, particularly Luke, but there are authors who we've published or will publish. Frank Mackey, a book is coming out in 2 weeks. David Bourgeois, who is got a book called Full Fathom 5, which is coming out next year. He's with us. And there's a number of other friends online. Jim Upton, the author of the book Maker, which came out last September. A very good book, one of these rare things called working class literature. And it came out last fall. I think it's an important book. So I want to welcome you and thank you for attending this launch. I'd like to offer you all a glass of wine, but we're still not present, in-person launches. Hopefully we'll be doing that again by the fall. I just want to explain to you, at these launches, I'd like to explain what it made us interested in this book, Foxhunt, and that brought me to publish it, because we're a small publishing house, and the only books we publish are books that we really like. Because we do get a lot of queries, probably almost one a day, if you can imagine, and we can't even keep up with the authors. So when we do choose a book, it's because we like it and we think it's an important book, and whatever the period. So Foxhunt, Luca proposed it to us about a year ago, I guess. Yeah, it was about a year ago. And I immediately was taken by the subject and the writing. And I think it become even more relevant now than it was a year ago. We all know about about the Hollywood and the blacklist and the Cold War in the film industry, and what it meant for people who didn't go along with the McCarthyism and who stood up to it. But we have less familiarity with the cultural wars that were being hit the literary community. And I know that we had the rumors came around about people like Steinbeck, Dos Passos, Garcia Marquez, Orwell, and many others. Rumors about, who were they working with? Did they get money from organizations that they would have been embarrassed about? And all kinds of questions, but there was little done about it. And the interesting thing is that we often have a situation now which can resemble what was going on in the late 40s and the 50s. As a publisher, we got just to give you an example, got a letter from the Minister of Canadian Heritage telling us, because we get some grants from the Canadian government, telling to us that they do not want anybody who receives grants to have anything to do with Russian artistic efforts that have any link with the Russian government. And it's all very nicely couched in nice words. And then they put something in bold face saying, if you do, you will not get any more funding. So in other words, it doesn't hit us, but you can see the mindset that is in there, that's sent out to all organizations who receive funding from the Canadian government. So there is a state of mind that is reestablishing. So this book deals with that and how artists, writers is affected by it. Luke has done massive research for this book. But the secret about his book is that the artistry wins over the research. In other words, you don't know when you're reading it that there's all this massive research. You ask questions as you're reading and say, now, does something like this really happen? So you go back to Google and then you find something in it, but it's written in such a way that you don't even realize that just such research has gone into it. The question of we often hear this expression "art for art's sake," as if art can exist in a vacuum outside of the general political debates and the political upheavals. I think that is and I think that you would realize in this book is that it's never as simple as that people can be used knowingly or unknowingly. Sometimes they will choose to turn a blind eye because there can be quite a bit of money involved if you turn a blind eye. So, and as you know, like if you've ever tried to convince somebody of something and you feel like you're sometimes talking to a brick wall, it reminds me of what Upton Sinclair said. It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on he's not understanding it. This book, as I say, it's a wonderful story. You want to know what's happening, and then you want to go back and say, boy, did these things happen? And you'll go back and do research, and you want to know more about it. So I'm really proud to have published this book. It's being very well received until now. Now, just to introduce Luke, Luke Francis Beirne was born in 1995 in Ireland. He grew up in Western Canada. He has ghostwritten more than a dozen genre novels. His fiction and poetry have appeared in The Honest Ulsterman, Hamilton Arts and Letters, and Adelaide, including the award-winning story Models. He's holds a master's degree in cultural studies and critical theory from McMaster University, where he worked as a teaching assistant for the English department. And Foxhunt is his first novel. He lives in St. John, New Brunswick. So I turn it over to you, Luke.
Thank you, Robin. That was a great introduction. And I'm really happy that Baraka published the book. When I submitted it to them, I didn't expect to hear back as quickly as I did. And Robin contacted me and we had discussions about the book, and it was clear that it was a good fit. And so we moved ahead very quickly with the after the initial submission, and it was a great process. I'm very happy with that. The book itself, I really started to write in about 2018. I'd finished my undergrad degree, and my undergrad degree, I did an honors thesis focused on literary propaganda of the Cold War. And I really focused on the Congress for Cultural Freedom, specific organization that was tied up in Cold War propaganda in London. And that magazine, or that organization, published a magazine called Encounter. And Encounter was a huge magazine at the time, edited by Stephen Spender. It had publications by Nancy Mitford, Bertrand Russell, T.S. Eliot, Virginia Woolf posthumously, and just anybody who you can think of at the time that was major in England or in America was publishing magazines such as Encounter. So this magazine, it turned out in the 60s, was a CIA front. It had been sponsored by the CIA and created by a CIA organization. And when I was doing the research into that, I thought that it was a great topic for a novel as well as, a research project. So once I was done my degree, and I moved to Kingston, Ontario, started working on the book. And then the following year, I went to McMaster to continue do some graduate research, and I focused on literary propaganda of the Cold War again, but focused more on an American magazine, Perspectives, edited by James Laughlin. And that magazine was very different from Encounter, but it had a similar type of purpose. It was exported from America to Europe in the post-war era. And the intention was kind of shifting the general cultural sentiment to be favorable to American interests. And they did that by, not necessarily hardline attacks on communism or on people who are friendly to the Soviet Union, but on pumping money into kind of soft left organizations and publishing soft left pieces and trying to emphasize something that would serve as a gutter so people would, you know, essentially not go too far to the left. And that was one of the approaches. So I thought that was also interesting because you hear about blacklists and you hear about anti-communism in Hollywood and things like this during the 50s. And then there's the COINTELPRO, you know, the FBI and all of that. But you don't hear so much about the literary establishment and what happens that's more subtle, the way that cultural sentiments are constructed and shifted. So I thought that was just an interesting topic for exploration. But as Robin said, though it was rooted in a lot of historical research, my first intention was just to write a good book, a good novel. And so I focused really on just writing a book that I thought was a good book with this context behind it. And I emphasized the relationships between the characters and the general atmosphere of the book. And I focused a lot on various writing styles that some of them were popular at the time that the book was set, and some of them were, you know, for instance, I have some more American style sections, and in other sections I have more British style, and they kind of struggle for dominance in the book in the same way that the geopolitical situation was. You know, I was trying to play with that a bit. But anyway, the purpose there is I was focused more on the book itself as a work of fiction. And then when the book released, I've seen it categorized a few times as historical fiction. And until it released, I hadn't even considered that. I just thought of it as a novel, you know, a literary novel that was set in the 50s. And so that's something that's interesting to me. And I guess in some ways it technically is historical fiction, but it's not really historical fiction in the same way that it's generally understood. So that was just something interesting to me about it. I'm going to read a couple of sections from the book, and the sections that I've picked focus more on the rhythm of the prose as opposed to, you know, majorly story-driven sections. And I think that my purpose for doing that is to try and emphasize parts of the book that people might not pick up on a first reading. That, you know, when you read the book, I think people will pick up on the storyline, the Cold War situation, the interactions between the characters and the characters themselves. But it's easy to read past some of the more technical things that I was trying to do in the book. So I want to focus on those. And for a little context, the first section opens following a fox hunt. The main characters in this book are writers, and they go to London. There's Canadian writers and American writers in London to work on a cultural magazine. And one of the characters, the main character, Milne Lowell, goes to a fox hunt with a British character. And this is in the aftermath of that. But I don't think that the story itself needs too much explaining, because I'm just going to read some of the language. Neon strips flickered in Piccadilly Circus. Signs lifted from curving walls. Prince of Wales, Coca-Cola, Craven A, Guinness time. In alleyways, women leaned against doorways smoking cigarettes. Policemen lurked nearby. Milne stepped back from the road and scanned the faces emerging from the steps of the underground in twill and kidskin. Black cabs and red buses stopped and started behind them. Marguerite appeared on the steps wearing a narrow corduroy skirt and a plaid coat. Milne called out to her. She looked over and waved. He pulled his cigarette case from his coat and offered one to her when she neared. She took it and thanked him. He lit it with a match as she blocked the wind. They crossed the road to the fountain. How was the hunt? Marguerite asked. It was about what you'd expect, Milne replied. Did Carson enjoy it? I don't think so. Marguerite stopped and sat on the edge of the fountain, the breeze in strong gust and blew short strands of hair across her forehead. She looked out absently at people passing by. Was it absolutely horrible? She asked. Milne watched the water cascade from the top of the fountain behind her. He thought of Pankhurst's eyes staring into his own. When he swallowed, he could taste the putrid iron of blood. Yes, he said, it was. Marguerite stared at them from where she sat, one leg crossed over the other. Do you regret going? She asked. Milne didn't respond. Marguerite finished her cigarette and stubbed it out. They walked to the square and followed the curving road beneath a sign for Gordon's Gin. They passed through a narrow alleyway where boys hung from windows above, looking down over the street. A black Bentley rolled to a halt at the entrance ahead. A wrinkled face peered from the back window at them, and then the car slowly carried on. They went into a restaurant that Carson had suggested. The ceiling was low and the room was dark and quiet. They were seated near the back and ordered martinis. Milne looked around. He wondered about the people around him. A woman in a wool dress sat alone at a table beside them, drinking wine and watching the door. A waiter brought their drinks to them. Have you talked to Nicholas about Columbia? Marguerite asked when the waiter left. I spoke to Carson, Milne said. I'll write to Nicholas about it this week. You said you would go? Of course. I'm just going to skip ahead a small section here. Their food arrived and they ate and talked until the candle on the table burned low in its cradle. After dinner, they walked a short distance to Soho. Dusk pulled down to the sky. Lanterns hung over the streets, casting a flickering yellow glow. They passed restaurants, tailors, cafes, and newsstands. Men in patched coats smoked cigarettes in front of closed shops. Children begged on the streets. Someone called to Milne, offering rationed meat in any amount. A crowd passed in blackface, screaming and dancing, casting echoes. The lanterns cast their subtle light on wooden signs, Twinings, Imperial Tobacco. Milne and Marguerite walked in the lamplight and avoided alleyways until they reached a club on Dean Street. The doorman let them in. Inside, they were engulfed in its folds. The rooms were small and the groups were select. Winter waned and flowers blossomed, forsythia, foxtail, and monkshood. The woolly remnants of a Russian fixation faded from fashion. Reports from Korea continued to flow, bringing news of starvation and slaughter, and the Rosenbergs went on trial. The spring was long and damp and often colder than the winter before. And so that's the end of that section. The reason I read that section is because I think that some of what I was trying to do with language comes through clearly there. The first sentence, neon strips flickered in Piccadilly Circus, signs lifted from curving walls, Prince of Wales, Coca-Cola, Craven A, Guinness time. It's the repetition, I think, there, the I's and the C's. Neon strips flickered, Piccadilly Circus, and the C's roll into S's as well, circus into signs, lifted curving walls, Prince of Wales, Coca-Cola, Craven A, Guinness time. But then also this section, I think, has subtle gestures at everything that's going on underneath. There's talk about Twinings, Imperial Tobacco, and crowds in blackface, and various gestures towards colonialism and imperialism. And they're meeting in Piccadilly Circus, which at the time was an impoverished part of London. And so these characters are existing in London on, inflated CIA salaries, and they're not existing in the same way that most people in London are in the post-war era. And so there's a displacement there, which I also tried to gesture at, which, it's not explicit, but it's kind of under the surface. So then the second section I'll read from is a little further in the book, and there's a minor spoiler, but I don't think it's anything that's too significant. And I'm focusing on this section because, as I mentioned before, I tried to emphasize American styles in certain sections and British styles in other sections. And here's a section where the American style comes on really strong. And it was a style of writing that became popular in American literature, a certain type of masculine American literature leading up to this period, where there was repetition, blunt phrases, and short sentences. And it kind of comes through here, I think. So, Clifford arrived at 8:35 in the morning. Milne was sleeping solidly when he heard the knock. He answered the door and invited Clifford in to wait while he dressed. Clifford wore a blue blazer and two-tone derbies. When they left, it was 8:55 and the sun was rising quickly above the rooftops. The rooftops were black and gray and the sun was warm and bright. They walked for a while between flat stone buildings and stopped in a park where the grass was short and green and stretched out between the streets. They sat on a bench between hedges and flowers, looking out at the fountain in the square. And Milne began to recall the events in Columbia for a third time. Clifford smoked Camels. He didn't interrupt or ask any questions. When Milne finished talking, they sat silently. The space was filled with chirping birds and rushing water from the fountain. Who led? Clifford asked after a while. This man Hector or Eduardo? Milne thought back. He eyed a magpie on the hedge. I'd say that Hector did, he said. Clifford nodded and drew on a cigarette. Milne watched him. He wondered what he thought, what he knew. Do you know what he meant? Milne asked. Why he thought we could find him guns. Clifford shrugged. They figure that any American can get them guns down there. We're not even American, Milne said. It's all the same to them. He thought we worked for the government, Milne said. It seems so. They sat and watched the birds play around the fountain and young couples pass, giggling behind false composure. They can't imagine that anyone would do this for the right reasons, he said. It's why the communists have such luck down there. Some here think the same thing. The fact that intellectuals and the state share certain commitments isn't a bad thing, Clifford said. It simply means that the government represents the people. A few years ago, people knew that. He sighed. Everyone's been out for blood since the Rosenbergs. They sat for a while longer and then continued to walk through to the other side of the park. How do you feel? Clifford asked. A little shaken up, he replied. They rounded the corner and began to walk back up the path towards Milne's apartment. We made a mockery of their country, he added. We shouldn't have sent you down there. I'm sorry about that. Milne nodded. It's all right. Nobody could have predicted that. No, they couldn't have, Clifford agreed. We'll take care of Carson. Don't worry about that. They reached the end of the park and turned. They walked back towards Milne's apartment along the street. What do you know about Ignacio? Milne asked. Nothing yet, Clifford said. It was a shock to us all. What happened? He kept an apartment in Berlin and stayed there much of the time. He was meant to be somewhere and didn't show up. When they left, his apartment was cleared out. Someone claims to have spotted them crossing the border in the back seat of a car. Milne shook his head. What would compel you? He asked. Delusion or power, said Clifford. Sometimes it's a woman, but with Ignacio, I doubt it. It began to get colder and the leaves fell from the trees. Nicholas organized a festival in Paris. For every day of autumn, a symphony, opera, or ballet performed. Orchestras arrived in from Vienna, Boston, Rome, and Berlin. Work on the magazine continued with little break. Though he didn't come into the office, Carson's name stayed on everything. The magazine grew and every morning brought with it submissions and queries. In the evenings, they sat together, drinking wine and gin, and playing cards or dancing. They ate together and laughed, and Columbia stopped weighing so heavily upon them. It was distant and peripheral. They missed Carson, but did not call upon him out of pity or shame. Eric said that he had noticed Carson taking Benzedrine before the trip and felt like he was to blame. The nights were cool and the parks began to empty out. The leaves were golden on the ground and the vines turned against the brick and stone, and then slowly the color faded and the leaves began to melt into the ground and rain came more frequently and brought a bitter chill with it, and the autumn slipped away. When winter came, the branches were brittle and bare and wind howled through the alleyways at night. Inside, fires crackled and coal burned. Dark plumes rose from smokestacks and chimneys and lingered, trapped beneath the cold layer above the city. Particles drifted down and stained the earth and stone. And that's the end of that section there. So that's my reading. Yeah. I think that Robin had a few questions afterwards.
Yeah. And I'm sure other people will have questions, but let me just start with the Columbia question, because you mentioned in that reading, it's Columbia and something happens. Tell us a bit about that question, about the Columbia caper, you could call it. And it would in things that did happen in that period in that America, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. So in the book, what happens is these writers in London, American and Canadian and British writers, are working on a magazine dedicated to cultural freedom. And two of the writers are asked to go down to Columbia to meet with a prospective editor for a magazine that's being established in Columbia for the same purpose. And they go down there, and things really don't go according to plan, and it turns out the people they're meeting are kind of, they're not who they were expecting. I don't want to spoil too much for anyone who hasn't read it yet, but the situation that's rooted in is, as Robin said, there is some reality behind that. During this era, there were some American writers sent down to Argentina to meet with the prospective editors of a magazine, which was funded by the CIA and opened up for an attempt to develop an anti-communist sentiment in Latin America. And the events of the book don't correspond, with the real situation, but that was my inspiration for the events in the book. And there were things that happened down there that were kind of shady, and people who went down there, one of the guys, I think it was, I can't remember who it was, so I don't want to defame anyone because it's being recorded. But somebody, a major writer, ended up getting institutionalized afterwards based on a certain event that happened. So that was an inspiration for part of the book as well. But yeah.
There's I think I told you this, but I want to ask you about it. The main character, Milne Lowell, and I don't want to spoil much, but he reminds me of a Graham Greene character, like a book in a Graham Greene book, like some of the characters, the way they are kind of effaced, they're kind of withdrawn, they're reticent, and then sometimes they rise to the occasion. But did Graham Greene inspire you? Because he was it was a Cold War writer, and he wrote one of the best anti-Cold War books, which was The Quiet American. Was he an inspiration for you?
He was, yeah. And The Quiet American, I have a great copy of that book where it's the Viking critical edition, and it has all these essays that go along with it and explain historical context and various things. I think that's a great book. And yeah, it was an inspiration. And I think the plot structure in my novel in ways is influenced by Graham Greene as well, because it comes off a slow start and builds up, and all these things are happening under the surface, but it seems maybe outwardly at first that not much is happening at all. And then all of a sudden there's a tipping point and everything starts to spiral very fast. And that's the way that a lot of Graham Greene books, play out. And so he was a major influence in ways, and also the atmosphere. He also wrote scripts for movies. He was a screenwriter, and The Third Man was set in Vienna in post-war years, and was kind of an inspiration as well. The atmosphere in that book, or in that film. And then the other thing about The Quiet American was that it released in 1955, and I was reading a lot of books that came out in the late 40s and early 50s, particularly by British writers, and particularly, dealing with Cold War context. And so that was one of the books that I was drawing on specifically. Other ones that I read, Darkness at Noon, which was kind of an anti-communist book that was funded and distributed by the CIA and other government organizations. And I think it's not nearly as good a book, but it was very successful as well, and influential at the time. So there's a lot of books that I was looking at.
I have one other question, but then I do want to leave it open. But you're a big boxing fan, I can tell. You wrote an article in appeared today in Counterpunch, and there's a fight in the book, and you get into the fight when you're reading it.
Yeah,
But it turns out that the people who were fighting that the fight took place.
it
You
did.
weren't
Yeah,
there, you weren't there, but so tell us about what that meant for you, like writing about that in a novel like this.
yeah. The fight in question is Joey Maxim versus Freddie Mills. Freddie Mills is a British boxer, and he was a national icon. And he, starred in film noirs and movies afterwards. Joey Maxim at the time wasn't hugely well known. He was an American boxer, and the fight happened, and it happens, at the same time. And I wrote the fight into the book for metaphorical reasons in a lot of ways. It's in the post-war era, and after the Second World War, America really was launched into a new position of dominance, which it has retained ever since. It quadrupled industrial production during the war, and its military bases expanded across the globe. And former powers like the UK were kind of in ruins. And so in that fight, Joey Maxim went to England, underdog fighter, and he knocked out Freddie Mills and knocked out his teeth during the fight. And so that's in the book, and they go to that. It's the first thing that Milne, the main character, does when he gets to London, is he goes to this fight. And so that was a metaphorical thing there. But the fight itself, I think, it's an interesting event that also situates a certain time and place and atmosphere, and it has, because Freddie Mills was also in film noirs, there's a little gesture to that as well. And it has that atmosphere, which I like.
I would have several more questions, but I'd like to open it up to anybody who has questions about the book. If you haven't read it, or if you read it, please ask them now.
Frank? I think you're still muted, Frank.
Frank, are you able to unmute yourself?
Is there, Frank, if you want, you could ask the question on the chat. You could write it in. There we go.
There.
I
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
can, yeah.
Okay. It wasn't so much a question, but an observation. I mean, this brings to mind so many things, so many memories. One of the first things I thought of was there was a roundtable discussion in Paris back in around that period, 1950s. Jean-Paul Sartre was taking part in it. And he was talking about, they were talking about literature. And he mentioned that because of the Cold War, it didn't matter whether you actually discussed the bomb or anything in the novel, there was any mention of the bomb, but it was there in the background. It was that kind of anxiety that behind every piece of writing, there was the bomb, which is something that struck me. The other thing is that my own experience, I remember, is that I used to read a lot of nonfiction books. I was a great fan of poetry, but I also like to read nonfiction books. And there was a time when I was living in Newfoundland, and for some reason, I went on a jag reading about Nazi Germany and all kinds of sordid stuff there. And at a certain point, I just had enough, and I I started reading a book by William Butler Yeats. And I was so delighted. It just struck me so strongly that here was somebody who could write. Because all those books on the Nazi Germany were very prosaic. I mean, the prose was very, you know, and I think you can get used to that kind of very ordinary prose that has no taste, you know, no color, no smell or anything like that. And then when you read somebody who can really write, it's very impressive. So anyways, I haven't read your book, but it just talking about it now and the way you were discussing it and everything, it just brought back all these elements from years ago like that. But I'll tell you one thing, I have a problem with your readings where you mentioned Columbia, because when the name first came up, I thought, oh, they're talking about the university, this business about Britain and America. And I'm thinking, oh, Columbia University. So somebody in London is possibly going over to Columbia University for some purpose, but no. So it's only just now with the questions from Robin that I realized, okay, that Columbia. Yeah, because we don't see it when you speak of it. You don't see the spelling of it. So I just thought, oh, it's the university.
Yeah. Well, no, and the Sarge connection there is interesting as well, because he was tied up in all of this, kind of what they called the battle for the hearts and minds, you know, at that time.
Yes.
And Sarge himself was a target by a lot of these programs.
Yes.
And, you know, he had a magazine, and I can't remember the name of it right now, but it was specifically being countered by some of the magazines that were being funded. So that is an interesting connection as well.
Yeah. There's also his girlfriend, Simone de Beauvoir, right? Because I know she wrote a book called L'Invité, I think, where there is this problem of, there's one character who remains neutral. And there's this great argument going on about you can't be. You have to be one side or the other. You can't. I think the person, in fact, is a newspaper editor or something like that. And these people are trying to convince him that, you know, you can't do that. You know?
Yeah, and that was a big focus of these programs. You know, one of the things that when they were being exported, they would export to countries that they said had a problem, a neutrality problem, and essentially the focus was on this idea that you couldn't remain neutral, you couldn't be unaligned with either power bloc, you know, Soviets or the US. And so if you were neutral, you were automatically, in the Americans' eyes, Soviet, you know. And so they attempted to influence them, to sway them to be pro-American as opposed to neutral.
Yeah. Well, that's it. If you're not with us, you're against us.
Yeah.
Anyways, so somebody else?
Yeah, Jim Fisher from the Miramichi Reader.
Thanks, Robin. So I talked to Luke extensively in the podcast about the book, but I'm just curious. I like the second reading you did with the American style, because I felt that parts of the book were noirish, like even in London, like the Piccadilly Circus, the dark alleys, you know, lighting cigarettes, things like that. So, but I'm kind of curious for your first novel was. And I don't want to put anybody on the spot here, like Robin or yourself, but was Baraka Books, like, how did you come to choose them out of, you know, hundreds of publishers out there?
Well, I knew that the book more or less was a book that would need to be published by a small press, you know, to start with. And I also, when I was looking at options, I thought that Baraka seemed like a very suitable option because of their particular interest. You know, they publish a lot of political nonfiction, and they publish a lot of literary fiction, and a lot of books with a historical turn to them as well.
Right.
And they'd published a couple of books, Exile Blues, in recent years, which was, you know, it's similar in some ways, I think, thematically. There's, you know, not CIA, but there's FBI, COINTELPRO kind of things behind
Right.
that, and the Einstein Files and Montreal and the Bomb. Various books that seemed like they would make a good fit. And what really sold me on Baraka was the Ishmael Reed connection, of course. So I submitted to them, and Robin reached out, and he explained why he thought it was a good fit. And when we spoke on the phone, it just, it was clear to me at least that it was the way to go. So.
Good. And just one other sort of related question. I always, and I don't think I asked you this on our podcast interview, but did you ever consider self-publishing at any point, or did you look into it?
No, I didn't. I wanted to be traditionally published, but I do have a certain. I have more respect for self-publishing than some people do. I think that there's a lot of validity to it, and in this era, particularly with the way that major publishers work, I think. But no, I didn't really consider it for this book. No.
Okay. Well, that's all the questions I had. Thank you, Luke.
Yeah.
Can I just say something about it? We just hope that we can do the necessary promotion for a book like this, so the book gets known. That is the big challenge in these times. It's very difficult. Just getting the books into bookstores. Amazon has basically killed the industry, has hurt the industry a lot, so that people don't go to bookstores, and so they go on Amazon and everything. So that's just our hope, is that we can do a book like this, do justice to it, because that is always that's our challenge. But and self-publishing can be good, but it's a lot of work too. Like, in other words, once all the relations with all the different distributors and so on, it's something that a publisher ends up establishing. It's like an infrastructure, so you do get an advantage from it. But so anyway, that was a.
Can I just add to that? In writing a book, I mean, I like writing, I like researching. I don't like publishing. That whole aspect of where you send the book to a publisher, and then you get into all the business about, oh, well, can you write a little bit about like this for the back cover? Can you suggest ways to market the book? Can you proofread this? All that. I just find like, leave me alone. I want to write the book and research, but I don't want to be involved in that aspect of it. I'd just be as happy if somebody else just took care of everything, took it off my hands after I'm finished. Did you feel that way at all?
No, I mean, I think that the other thing is publishers, as Robin said, do have the network in place already, and know how to handle everything, and so it is better off someone else's job. But
yeah. It's like laying carpet, I mean, you could do it at home, but it's going to take you forever, and you're going to make all kinds of mistakes. But you get somebody who's good at it, and they'll come lay it out, cut it up and everything, and it'll take a minute, Fine.
Anyway, I'm sorry to both of you for having gotten you to, you hear me, for having gotten you to proofread your work. But don't worry, we had a great proofreader, Blossom Tom, among others, and we have a good network of people doing this kind of thing. But I know that authors, once they submit, they do want to improve their text, and our problem is to make them not to improve too much at the end, because it can make it worse, and you can add new errors.
Yeah.
But we do want to make sure that they're happy with the result, and that So anyway.
No, it's true. I say that, like, I don't want to do the proofreading, all that sort of stuff. I do, because I want to have my hand in and make sure that everything is okay, But it's that whole production end of it that I'm not comfortable with, and I figure that my job is mostly writing and researching, and that's the main part, as far as I'm concerned. And then somebody else can take care of the rest. I don't feel competent.
So I'm sure there are more questions about the book. Is there? Anybody?
Dead?
Yeah, Gerard Beirne. I think he's related to you.
He is, yeah, slightly related.
He's got his hands up. Hand up.
Hi, Luke. Sorry, I can't put my video on. My connection is really poor. It's freezing quite a bit.
That's
So I
okay.
won't take the risk of that. But calling in from the west coast of Ireland, so that's partially to blame, I guess. Anyway, firstly, it's just to congratulate you, Luke. I'm thrilled to be able to be here as part of the launch. It's fabulous to hear you speak and to read from the book. And I wish you every success with it. It's a very impressive book. I think it's reveals a wisdom beyond your years, and I love that writing can do that. That it can probe down deep inside of us and reveal things about life that might not otherwise be revealed. Listen, there's been a lot of talk in the various tonight and other interviews and what I've been reading about the book about the political side of it and the big thematic issues. But at its heart, it's a book that's filled with humanity, and it's a very tender book about people struggling in life and trying to make their way through. So I didn't know if you wanted to talk to that or address that in some way outside of the political sphere.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and thank you also for everything there. But I do think that that's a very good point, and the book does have at its core, it has human characters, as I said in one of the interviews, wandering around in a displaced world, trying to find their part in it, right? And they are displaced, both physically, they're living in London and they're not from London, but they're also displaced because of the situation that they're existing in, in the post-war era, and not just the political implications of that, but all the implications of living in that era, right? So I tried to really get into the relationships between the characters as well, and the questions, and tackle why and how people in the literary world navigated this type of thing, and so the political situation is always underlying it, but I think it is underlying it, right? At the heart, it is it's a novel, about the characters.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, you were cutting in a little in and out for me there, but I think it is, and I think it's in that sense, it's as relevant today. Again, it's relevant politically, we hear that, but it's relevant just in terms of again that human quality that you have there that I really admire in the book. Yeah.
You cut out slightly there, but I think you're, and one of the things, there's a comparison to noir that comes up regularly with this book as well. And I think the way a noir story tends to play out is that in a noir, like film noir, there's a crime that occurs, and then that's the frame for all of the psychological issues at hand, and so the characters then navigate these conflicts internally through this frame, and so the crime, maybe a bank robbery or a murder or whatever it is in a noir, but in this, the frame is this Cold War situation, but it really is about the characters, the psychological navigation of it, and I think that the structure of the book plays to that as well. And my intention with it was that it spirals in a way that's similar to, as I said, kind of the Graham Greene type of plot structure. But the reason for that was because when things start to reveal themselves to the main character, then he's dealing with them in this fast-paced way, and everything is coming to a head really quickly. And I tried to convey the psychological aspect of that in the action and the atmosphere of the book as well. So that was all at play.
Can I interject here? This relative of yours in west coast of Ireland, what time is it there? It's the middle of the night.
It is. It's 10 minutes to 1.
Oh well, not too bad.
I should be getting my beauty sleep.
Yes, I was thinking it was like 2 or 3 in the morning, and I was going to say, there's a compliment. Somebody who stays up till 2 or 3 in the morning to talk about a book.
Maybe I would be allowed to say that Mr. Beirne is Luke's father, and he's a very accomplished writer and teacher of writing at Sligo, if I'm not mistaken, University.
Huh.
And so and I think the point he's making is very important because it is a very human story
Yeah.
in a situation where there's all kinds of pressures. And, on the cover, we talk about a thing of passivity and loyalty. And without revealing too much, there's a lot of loyalty that comes out, friendship and loyalty, as the book unfolds. We won't want to give the story, but it is a test of devotion to a friend, and is the person able to handle this kind of thing? So that it's a very human story, and that's what keeps you reading it. By the way, it's not just the Cold War.
Yeah.
It is because the story keeps you going on. So.
Okay.
Rob, our friend Rob Rolfe is on here. He's a writer in Owen Sound, publisher and published poet, and he just says, "Congratulations to author and publisher. Very interesting presentation. I look forward to buying and reading the book." So
Thank you, Rob.
There you go. You're rich.
thanks, thank you, Rob Rolfe. Good to have you on today.
I have a question, Robin.
Yeah.
Luke, didn't have the chance to read your book yet, but I will for sure. It seems very interesting.
Thank you.
Considering what is happening these days, we have let's see, I don't know if we can say we have a new Cold War in a way. Do you see yourself writing a sort of another novel, but in a more contemporary,
Contemporary context?
Context, yeah, or are you going to remain like historical context, or?
I don't think I will, or I haven't been planning to, but not that I wouldn't write a more contemporary book, but I haven't been thinking about writing a book set with this specific context,
Okay.
But I do think that there are, there's a lot of questions today that the book can speak to, and it doesn't need to necessarily be set in the contemporary time period to speak to that. But I think that's not something that I'm immediately thinking about anyway.
Okay. I was just wondering because it's like, what we are living these days. I was just wondering. That's why.
No, yeah, and it's a good question, but I think one of the things that this book allowed me to do, setting it historically, you have benefit of hindsight in a lot of ways, and you have perspective on it.
Yeah.
There's something that my dad actually said one time about writing more recently, but when you're writing in present tense versus past tense, present tense is kind of more growing in popularity these days, but you write in past tense, the characters themselves have an opportunity for reflection on their own actions. And I think that that's something that this book, allowed as well, because the book isn't contemporary. So there is that extra layer of reflection that can be added. That's something.
And also in the present tense, you don't know really what is real, what is a fact, what is false.
It's a lot easier to do the research.
It's very difficult to understand what is happening in a way.
It is, yeah.
What really is happening.
Yeah. It's a good question. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Luke.
If we're going to suggest material for another novel, it just came to me that I used to know a woman in Vermont. She was an Irish lady, came from Dungannon, Eva Healy. She was a niece of Tim Healy, who was, I think, Governor General or something in Ireland at the time. But she and her sisters, they went to Russia at the time of the revolution, and they served as governesses for the royal family and people in that circle. And then when the revolution broke out, they had to flee, and they crossed Russia in a cattle car and down to Turkey, being shot at as they went. She came to North America, and she served as a kind of a governess childminder for various elite families in New England, and wound up in Vermont running a little daycare center. And I remember meeting, I knew her quite well. We stayed at her place a few times there. A lovely little woman, but it always struck me as like, what a remarkable story. You know,
It is quite a story.
to go from Southern Ireland to St. Petersburg, and St. Petersburg to, I think she was around New York in the States, and then eventually retired or went to this small village in Vermont, which was just a kind of idyllic little place. There you go.
Are there any other questions? You were talking about whether it's historical fiction or what. It's often a question. I mean, in publishing, they always want us to define the genre. Historical fiction is often about real characters and their fictionalized stories. I find it's like, this is like, I call it literary fiction in a historical context. It's like,
Yeah.
The English Patient, which, we made into a film. It was a literary case of a literary fiction, but it was in a historical context. And that's what this is, because I mean, you do have real people that occur that really existed, but the story, your people are all imagined.
Yeah, and the entire story, it's fictional, and fictionalized, and there's nothing in it really. There's references to real events in the same way that, if you have a contemporary novel, there's references to real events, but it's not an attempt to rewrite somebody's story, that's who already existed, right? So, yeah.
Yes.
So anyway, I might ask Luke to say some final words, but I do want to thank Jan Jorgensen, who very graciously has this Zoom account and helps us organize these online launches. And they're very useful for getting people in different continents and different places. It costs less than getting Luke to fly to Montreal and getting his father and other people come to Montreal. So it's just wonderful. I'd like to thank her for that. Blossom Tom, who does a lot of proofreading, but she also helps a lot in doing this kind of promotion. And I want to thank her for it. I also want to thank Luke for having confidence in Baraka Books. It's a challenge for a publisher to keep people's confidence. We do see, as you'll give us, there's something that they've sweated over and thought over, and you want us to treat it seriously. So that's that is always our challenge. And thank you all for attending. Jim Fisher for doing his work at the Miramichi Reader. I do recommend looking there at their book reviews and podcasts. It's really become a great website and great contribution to writing. And so
thank you, Robin.
And so maybe Luke, you can have a concluding remarks. And by the way, you can purchase the book online. It's still free shipping, but that's going to change soon because of what's going on with prices and everything and inflation. We might have to start charging for shipping again. So, but you can purchase it online at thebarakabooks.com, and that's the commercial side of my intervention. So maybe we could ask Luke to make some concluding remarks if nobody else has any other questions.
Before you make your remarks, Luke, I just want to point out to everyone that James Fisher posted the link to his interview with Luke in the chat box. So if you click on that, you'll be sent directly to the interview.
Great.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just thank everybody for coming, and I really appreciate everybody coming to listen to me talk about my book. And thank you for hosting the event. And thank you to Baraka, of course, for publishing the book. I've really appreciated how personal the whole experience has been. It's been a great experience. And I thanked Blossom earlier privately, but I'll thank her again here because everyone else can see it. She proofread the book and did a great job, and then helped organize this. And so I really appreciate that too. I'll thank my dad in particular because he's here. And it's late in Ireland, so thank you for coming. And then James Fisher as well, because we had a great podcast and that's available here if anyone wants to listen to it. And if no one else has any last questions, then
Great.
thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Luke.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Robin.
Okay,
Awesome.
and we'll have another one next Wednesday. It's Richard King's book, Serving Life. Richard passed away, but it's going to be Richard King's third novel. And 2 weeks from now, Wednesday the 18th, is Frank Mackey's book called The Great Absquatulator. I said the word. So it's something you're going to be interested to read. I thought it's a great story. It's a whole other world than Foxhunt. So,
Okay.
so thank
Thank
very
you.
much.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Good evening, everyone.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye,
Thank you.
Rob. Bye.
Bar is open.
Good
Good night, everyone.
night.